I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today to our live. This is one of our first live videos that we've done on YouTube as part of our Probate Polymath podcast. And we have a very interesting and exciting guest today, somebody who has seen the Tom Girardi trial throughout the entire thing firsthand in person. And this is a trial that we've been covering now for 2 weeks. And we've been very involved in terms of following the trial and giving our views of everything. But we couldn't have done that had it not been for the excellent reporting of Amanda Bronstad. And Amanda, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's so awesome to have you with us and in studio.
Thank you very much.
So we literally lived this trial through your eyes, and we read all of your reports. And of course, we were following your tweets. And we're just captivated by everything. And we just have probably 1,000 questions. We want you to recap the trial all the way through from start to finish. No, we don't have that kind of time. I'm sorry. But really, you know, I do have a number of questions, but is there kind of just an overall thought that you wanted to share before we get, start just hitting you with a bunch of questions?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I think probably, this is a lawyer. I actually don't cover criminal cases for law.com. I actually cover mass torts and class actions. So for me, this was an interesting, a little bit different than what I normally write about case. And what was interesting to me was that I knew Tom Girardi back in 2001. At that time, he was the president of the International Trial Lawyers Association. I was just, cutting my teeth on Los Angeles legal community, and he was a very friendly guy, and he was more than open to talk to the press. Over the years, I interviewed him over the cases that he filed and the cases he settled. And I became very familiar with Tom Girardi. I interviewed him several times. I've met with him in person several times. I've been to some of the crazy parties. I've seen him in all different venues and different scenarios. And this was a very different scenario. And I think it just really was a little bit surreal. It was a little bit surreal. And I don't think I'm alone. I think that people in the legal community who've watched him over the last decades, really, there's a little bit of shock, because as the trial unfolded, there was shock when he was charged, and there was shock when he went to bankruptcy. But there was this whole other collective shock to listen to the evidence in trial and to listen to also his defense. And you really got a picture of what was really going on at Girardi Keys all those years. And I think that's like a part of the trial that kind of haunts me a little bit, because I think that's the first time a lot of us heard that much detail about what was really happening at his firm.
Yeah, and it happened for a long time, and it was just shocking. Even the number of bar complaints that were out there that apparently were never really looked into properly. It boggles the mind that this could happen for as long as it happened. And Stewart, you were making the point that Tom Girardi was a king of personal injury. And, he's somebody that we would see out at the Las Vegas convention for plaintiffs' attorneys every year, and he would hold court and have massive parties. And you never in a million years would think that this guy was running a Ponzi scheme. And yet that's what the jury decided in this case. What was Tom Girardi's demeanor like? You saw him in court. I think early on, there was something that you said in one of your articles about how he got into a little bit of a tiff with his attorney, and he was talking, arguing or something. It wasn't an argument, but some back and forth with his attorney. I mean, was this a guy who knew what was going on? Was he completely incapacitated? What was your impression of him?
Everyone asks me that question, and I think it's hard, even as you were sitting there every day, to know the answer to that. He was very stoic for the most part, and a lot of the times he would sit at the defense table and he would write in a yellow legal pad, and he would look at the jury and he would look at the judge. He didn't very often look at his lawyers. He did occasionally speak with them, though, and he even participated in a few sidebars, which was a little weird. I don't know how many clients do that.
Not that often.
So I feel like, was he involved? Well, for sure he was somewhat involved. Was he running the defense? No, I think that, every day, not every day, but there were many, many days where his lawyers would walk him into court and they would kind of like point to the defense table, like, remember, you sit there. Was it an act? I don't know. Could have been real. He also showed up in tennis shoes. slippers. I mean, he had the same gray blazer every single day. And it was, he slowly walked to the defense table every morning. Did the jury see that? Not yet. They saw when he took the stand. That's the first time they saw him walking into doing his little shuffle.
I see.
Amanda, this is Stewart. I really appreciate your reporting on this. I actually found objectivity in your writing, which I'm sure was hard to do based on the evidence as it unfolded. But I'm just curious. I love to watch juries when I'm in trial. I don't stare at them because I don't want to freak them out. But when I go and watch other great personal injury lawyers like Ara Shamanpour and Brian Panish and these people, I love to watch the interaction of the jury, just what they're looking at, what they're focusing on, what their facial expressions are. And when the Rui Gomez family testified, when Josefina Hernandez and Judy Selberg and Erica Saldana, when family members were testifying about how they had been harmed by this man, what was the reaction of the jury?
This jury they were very attentive for the most part, but they were very hard to read. I mean, they really didn't show a whole lot of expression on their faces. So that made it really hard to know what they were thinking. Near the very last couple of days with the defense, there was, I say this with like no evidence whatsoever, but there was a little feeling I got that maybe either they had already made their decision or they were getting tired, because you could see on their faces, like, like they kind of had this like, okay, you've said that already. And part of it was in the trial, there was starting to be a lot of repeat evidence. Here's that letter again that he wrote to the client. I do think there was a lot of parts of this trial that were very difficult to sit through, to be perfectly honest. There were a lot of numbers. And I mean, I'm a journalist, so of course I would think that maybe some of the jurors thought that was the most interesting part. But for me, it was like watching these numbers just fly left and right on both sides was a little head spinning. And I think they could have lost a few jurors on some of that. But when the clients got up and testified, it was heart-wrenching in a lot of cases. And the one that probably in the whole trial, the part that stands out to me the most was Erica Saldana. She was a client whose 1-year-old child was paralyzed after a drunk driver hit their car. The child was in a car seat. So Tom Girardi sued the car seat manufacturer for her, but she never got her full settlement money. And when she was on the stand, she actually had to testify on Zoom because she had COVID. And they tried to bring her up on the stand, and the judge was like, "What are you doing? She has COVID." And so they put her down to some other room, and she testified on Zoom. But when they showed her one of the emails she had written to Tom, this was after many, many, many phone calls, emails, that she had tried to get this money from him. And he was coming up with all sorts of explanations that she wasn't buying. None of these clients believed any of the excuses that he was giving. And this was her last email, and it was November 18th, 2020. And she stops and she says, now this is a woman who, first of all, she kind of looks a little sick because she's got COVID. She's reliving something that's just terrifying story, right? And she says, November 18th, that was my son's birthday. It was his last birthday before he passed away. The whole room just got silent. And she was just bursting into tears. And the judge had to call a break at that point. Which that's pretty, I can't believe that the jury didn't hear that and be affected by it.
And one follow-up question. What did you think of Judge Staten, and how did she handle the courtroom during the process of the trial?
Well, she was very, very fair. I mean, she gave both sides their due, but she was very strict about time. I mean, they could have been in the middle of doing witness testimony and have moved to their next question, and she'd go, "Okay, counsel, it's 4:30." And she's like, "It's time for the jury to go home." She was very respectful of the jury's time, but she also expected them to be there on time so they could stick to that schedule.
I see.
Well, that's good. Yeah, she ran a tight ship. That's what you expect from a federal judge, after all. And so, yeah, that was my big question: is what was the victim's testimony like? So, I mean, that just must have been amazing. Not amazing, but just heartfelt and emotional.
Impactful.
Impactful. That's what I'm trying to say. To hear that testimony.
Yeah, and Joe Rui Gomez, he was the first client. He was the one who was in a gas pipe explosion, and he had been burned all over his body. He went into a coma. This was back in 2010. He went through many, many years of recovery and surgeries, and he showed up. Of course, he was in a suit, so you didn't see a lot of his skin, but you could see a little bit of a part where he was probably burned, and then he kind of limped up to the stand. This is a young man, so you don't see a young man limping very often, and that was noticeable. Also, Judy Selberg, who was a woman whose husband died in the boat accident. She was a little bit older lady, but she had brought her emotional support dog into the courtroom. So when you see that, these are people whose stories they're definitely impacted by it. And it was very visual as well as listening to their testimony.
Yeah. I mean, real people who needed this money for their care and their injuries and all of that, and just weren't getting it. That's what's so crazy. So the IRS investigator, I forget his name off the top of my head.
Ryan Roberson.
Okay, Roberson. So he was the one, I'm sure, that was going through tons of numbers that you were talking about?
Yes, he had these amazing slideshows and graphs and charts. And the first thing that I thought when I saw them was, I bet the jury's not going to get that in the deliberations room, because it's not exhibits, it's not bank records, it's not. Of course, the defense's cross-examination of him went right to that point. What is this based on? And let's pull that apart. And let's look at the documents that you based your lovely little charts on. So they had to shut that down pretty quick.
It seemed to me that the defense actually did some good work there, and they actually pointed out some things he didn't analyze and include in his analysis. Can you speak to that? Did that seem to have an impact at all?
Well, he kind of went on this is the part of the trial where, when I said earlier, parts came out that I had never heard before. I think this was one of the things the defense was bringing up that kind of was new to me. But he was talking about, there was the San Bernardino office, and the San Bernardino office was opened late in Girardi Keese's history. And there was a bank account tied to that particular office. And the defense was definitely trying to put on that Ryan Roberson, this IRS agent, hadn't even considered the fact that a number of other Girardi Keese partners had actually opened this account. And there were emails where they were saying, don't tell Tom, let's keep this off his radar, things along those lines. And so it kind of implied that they were taking advantage of this man who was getting dementia and running this secret little side business over in San Bernardino. That was definitely the part of the story that he was trying to say, you didn't even know about that. Shouldn't you have known about that? Right. And Ryan Roberson got, a little defensive at first. The next day he was a little calmer, but he was like, it's not relevant. It's not relevant to our investigation.
Yeah, he might have had a discussion with the lawyers, I'm assuming, between day 1 and day 2 of his testimony.
It did seem that way. They really did.
Yeah. And I remember reading in your reporting about how he got defensive. And it's like, well, why get defensive? I mean, either you considered it or you didn't, and just, say that you did or you didn't. It's not that big of a deal for an expert, I think. But a lot of experts kind of feel like if they admit that they didn't consider something, that it, is a house of cards, it all falls down. But it sounds like he had a tremendous amount of documentary evidence about the money that was moving around, and more importantly, the money that was going out of the client trust account and into not necessarily Tom's own pocket, but for his expenses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, there were many charts. One of them that struck me was he was trying to show a cash flow situation. So you had the client money coming into the trust account, but then you had money coming from the trust account to the operating account of Girardi Keese. And then you had money going from the operating account to Girardi's personal bank account. But that's one step removed. And I could see the defense argument, well, and this is what they said, he's the owner of the firm. He was the only equity owner of the firm. If he's pulling money out of an operating account, that's actually okay, right?
Yes.
Of course, the response to that is, it's not okay when your clients are getting paid. But
right. Yeah, when you're taking more than your money. Now, if you're moving money from the trust account to the operating account and it's your attorney's fees, sure, you can do it all day long.
And of course, all the ledgers said fees.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, nobody was like, this is the money I'm stealing. I mean, it all said fees.
But the IRS agent, wasn't he able to show, though, like the Rui Gomez money, which I think this was Tom's downfall, his lies to his clients during, when they would call up and say, where's the money? And the fact that he told the Rui Gomez family they won a $5 million settlement when it was like $53 million. Didn't the IRS agent show when that money hit the trust account, it went immediately to this Ponzi scheme idea to repay the old clients who were still waiting for their money? Was that clear at the trial?
Well, that was the government's viewpoint, was that this $2.5 million paid to the Rio Gomez's many years later came out of a trust account that was actually had a deposit from another client. So yeah, that was part of their Ponzi scheme description. The problem with, I think, some of that was the defense had to admit a lot of things in this trial. And I got to be honest, they brought up so many fairly reasonable defenses given the circumstances. They had a firm that had commingled all these accounts, and they had commingling of different clients in the trust account. However, they tried to make the case that, a lot of firms do this. It's not like you have Judy Selberg's account and, the Rui Gomez account. It's the client trust account. So of course the money is all going to be kind of mixed together, right? So they had to admit a lot of things. They went with this office was in disarray. It was in chaos. And I don't think they were wrong when you start looking at how the was managed. I think chaos is a pretty good description, actually.
Yeah, it sounds very chaotic. So we have a comment off of YouTube asking what kind of response did Tom have when he heard the guilty verdict, because he saw Tom smiling when he was getting into his car from Cali.
Yeah. So in the courtroom itself, with the jurors sitting there, he had no emotion. He looked straight at the judge. Absolutely no emotion. When he left the courtroom and was walking down to his car, or walking down to wherever he went after the courtroom, it was just the regular Tom, just another day.
Wow.
Definitely had that vibe.
Amanda, did you attempt to talk to any of the jurors, or did the judge protect them and get them out of there so that nobody could talk with them?
I did not try to talk to the jurors. They actually, most of them, from what I understand, did not want to talk to us. They obviously saw us every day. I do know one juror did speak to Bloomberg, and he basically said, the witness that stood out to him was the expert witness on neurology who had done brain scan analysis of Tom Girardi's brain. Probably one of the drier parts of the trial, to be honest, but I think it went to the defense. The defense had two primary arguments. One was that Chris Camone, the CFO of Girardi Keys, had taken all this money and Tom knew nothing about it. The other one was that Tom was, in the throes of the beginnings of dementia. I think a key part of the defense's strategy on the dementia argument that fell apart was that they had this expert who testified that she had spoken with Mr. Girardi and analyzed him in 2021. The government's case is from 2010, 2020.
Right.
So even if he has dementia today, even if when he took the stand, he looked like a guy who didn't know what he was doing, it doesn't matter. And the government on their closing argument made a really hard point to emphasize that. They had a timeline they put up and they said, all of that doesn't really matter. What matters is who was Tom Girardi from 2010 to 2020. That was the period of time that our victims were had their funds embezzled.
Yeah, we kept focusing on that because we do trust and will litigation, and so we're always arguing about capacity and people's dementia, Alzheimer's, and the severity of it. And of course, we're always thinking of it in a point in time. So the only thing that matters to us is, did they have capacity at the time that they signed a will or a trust? And so this case was very similar to what we deal with, which is, okay, so he was losing his capacity in 2019, 2020. That doesn't really answer the question of everything he did from 2010 all the way up to 2019, when there seemed to be zero evidence of lack of capacity during those years. It was only in the 2019, 2020 when you started hearing some witnesses say he seemed to be losing it, he seemed to be confused, and all of that stuff. And then there was that bit about him potentially falling for a scam with the $5 billion check. What was that all about?
There was another one I knew nothing about.
Yeah.
That came out and everybody was like, what? So there was evidence from the defense that he was writing letters to Joe Biden about a foreign country judgment that somebody named Phipps White was insisting, and I think the company that he supposedly came from was Hollywood Land Development Company, was insisting that this judgment was tied up somehow where the federal government of the United States had to release it. And so Tom, it's really about as convoluted as I just said. There wasn't a lot of clarity on what we were talking about here. But Tom Girardi's emails were going around saying we need, like, he had letters to Joe Biden, who at the time was vice president of the United States. Did he know Joe Biden? Yes, he did personally. So it's not like completely crazy,
Right.
But there were emails from between the secretaries and the other partners at the firm saying, I thought we shut this down. Let's not forward this to Tom. Don't send that out. You know, and it was very clear. They were like, he's lost his mind and we can't let this come out. There was a cover up to try to keep it secret. That was kind of what the defense was trying to say with that.
I see. So yeah, maybe a lack of capacity, maybe the acts of a desperate man, who knows?
Well, when they had their expert was so limited because she'd only seen him in 2021, they had to go with witnesses, and they had the housekeeper, and they had, they had a lot of lawyers testifying about this. And but there were other lawyers the prosecutors put up who had worked on these client cases who said they never noticed anything wrong. So
something that hit me about the defense's medical expert, she was asked, and I think this was in your reporting, but she was asked essentially, well, was he incapable of committing fraud? And her response simply was, I don't know. I can't answer that. And so it seemed to me that, you know, she wasn't that strong for them. And then also hadn't Judge Staten, this was the same expert that had been used in the competency hearing, right?
Yes, that's right. Dr. Chu, she's at USC, and she was part of the competency hearing, and Judge Staten did not think she was credible enough to convince her, I guess. Also, she, you know, Judge Staten is a very soft-spoken, very fair judge, but that order in the competency ruling was pretty, he's feigning and exaggerating his symptoms kind of phrase. So that was a kind of, wow, okay, she really doesn't believe this. So
pretty harsh.
Yeah.
And then one other thing I noticed, the capacity argument I noticed was a timing issue, and they kept trying to get back to 2010, but they couldn't get there. I mean, 2020, maybe they can have a discussion. 2017, the car crash, and then you know he started acting strange and all those things, but they really couldn't get back further on the capacity argument. So then they turned to Christopher Kamen, and they spend their time saying how he's awful. I thought the prosecution did a beautiful job of describing Girardi and Keese as a den of thieves. In other words, yeah, maybe Christopher Kamen is a puke. Let's just accept that he's a bad guy and he's a horrible person. But that doesn't mean that Tom Girardi isn't also a bad person and did these things. And what was that like, hearing the closing argument when the prosecutor talked about the den of thieves idea? Do you think that hit its mark?
Yeah, and I think both sides really tied it up in the closing arguments. All this stuff we've been hearing for 3 weeks straight. I do think, yeah, they had, I mean, I've talked to other journalists about it afterwards, and a lot of them felt like the dementia argument was perhaps the stronger defense argument. But I kind of thought the Kamon argument was pretty strong, because they had, I mean, let's be honest, they had lots of witnesses coming in and talking about what a crook this guy was. And I mean, he kind of looks bad. They had a photo of him that they showed the jury. The jury got to see this guy who's currently in prison. I mean, this guy he's bad news, right? And so you couldn't say that, even if, I mean, I guess the prosecutors had to address it. They had to confront it, and they had to say it in a way that would make the jury still find Girardi guilty. I think the big question in the trial was, were they in cahoots? Or was it like they were all doing their separate things? I don't think we really ever figured out the answer to that, but they had to address it, both sides.
Yeah. So when we were surprised when Tom Girardi took the stand, but not surprised. I mean, surprised because, you know, he shouldn't have taken the stand probably, but not surprised in the sense that this is a guy who made his living talking to juries. I'm sure he couldn't help himself. You know, he had to get up there. He had to tell a side of the story, and maybe he had no choice. I mean, that might have been some of the best evidence he had, is just to get up there and deny it. But what was your impression of him on the stand, both on direct but also cross?
Well, first of all, the night before he testified was the first time the jury had left, and his lawyer stood up, and the judge asked, who are your witnesses still? Because she was very like, we're going to end this tomorrow, and we're going to put this in front of the jury on Monday. She had another trial on Tuesday, yesterday, so she was really, that was her main focus. And he mentions the two other witnesses who I didn't recognize. And then he says, and the defendant. And one of the prosecutors stands up and goes, well, this is the first we're hearing about this. And then on the day of, there was another witness before. And when she wrapped up, there was this very long break. And, you know, she's been very clockwork about the breaks being at 10:15, 10:30. And she let that jury take their break a little early, and it was a bit longer. And you knew that probably the jury was getting some suspicion that something was up because we were now going off the timeline. And during that time, one of the defense attorneys said, Your Honor, we'd like to speak to our client. So they went into the little conference room, and they were in there for quite some time. And then they came out. And, it was quite the moment because the jury comes back in, the judge is standing there, and she goes, Defense, would you like to call your next witness? And he goes, Yes, Your Honor, we call Thomas V. Girardi to the stand.
Wow.
And it was like, what? Everybody was like, get your pens ready.
Yeah. This is the moment. This is showtime.
That had to have been probably the highlight of the trial in the sense of just, he hasn't spoken since this whole thing has broke open in 2020. He hasn't even appeared in court. He hasn't appeared in bankruptcy court. He didn't appear in front of the federal judge in the Lion Air cases against Boeing when he was expected to. And the whole thing has been, he's just got dementia. He can't be here. And so for him to not only be there, but then talk, we got to hear Tom Girardi. Was I surprised that he testified? Not really. I think everyone else was. But if you know Tom Girardi, you weren't surprised.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he can't help himself, of course.
You felt like he was trying so hard to be quiet the whole time and wanted to talk to that jury. And when he did testify, he looked directly at that jury. They were sitting to his right, like right there. And he barely looked at the lawyers. He was very focused on the jury. What did I think? It was like watching an older version of the Tom Girardi that I have seen before. And could he have had dementia or some parts of it? Yes, that's very likely. But I also think he knew exactly what he was doing up there. There were a few statements he said where I went, that's a little like he kept telling his own lawyer, I'm not ready for cross. I'm not ready for cross.
Well, no,
right?
Yeah, I would tell my lawyer that.
Yeah.
And he kept repeating, I don't take a salary. I'm a good guy. I don't take a salary.
Yeah.
And then he would praise his employees. Well, it's the good people. They're the ones that we should, they're the ones that were doing all the work, and they're the good people. And he was very, very and I felt like his lawyer tried to keep him hemmed in, like on certain limited questions.
Yeah.
I have spoken to some criminal defense attorneys who said that's called damage control. Like you want to limit because then the cross examination is limited to those questions.
Right.
And you don't want him to have a field day on Tom Girardi on cross examination. So I felt like the cross examination was very short. There were a lot of that's all you're going to ask him.
Oh, right.
It kind of felt like that, but also powerful at the same time.
So when Tom was looking at the jury, was it like in an intense way or like a creepy way, or was it a desperate way?
It was a Tom Girardi way.
Oh, okay. Persuasive, trying to be persuasive. Right.
Yeah, very persuasive.
Mr. Personality.
Mr. Personality. That's exactly right. He was very I don't take a salary. Look, I'm a good guy. I'm a good guy. That kind of, I'm summarizing, but it's kind of that, he always had a very calm demeanor, and he had a very welcoming demeanor. He was easy to talk to. He kind of has I'm one of you kind of feel. And so I think he was doing that. But then, when his lawyer then comes up for a redirect question, and he says, is your law firm still open, Mr. Girardi? And he says, yes. And then he says, who am I? And he says, I don't know, bad, mean, terrible, one of those, right?
Yeah.
My reaction was, it's possible he doesn't know who that lawyer is. That was actually a guy who joined his defense team 6 months ago. So he hasn't been the guy that's been there all this time. But I also had a little bit of are we doing this just to make a point?
Yeah.
Right?
Is it a bit of a show?
But it's not so obvious that you could walk away and say for sure.
I see.
And Tom never did apologize in any manner, whether he was saying, I just feel bad for what happened to these people. There was no apology or anything, or did he get to that?
That's a really good question. No, not in those words. I think what he said was, if people weren't paid, I didn't know about that. And they asked him would you, on cross-examination, would it be okay for you to be, writing checks to EJ Global, your wife, Erica Girardi, when these clients hadn't been paid? Would that be okay? And he says, no, no.
By the way,
and then,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, he had to acknowledge that this all looked really bad, but his testimony made it sound like, I really didn't know. If I had known that Chris Camone was taking all this money and that people weren't getting paid, I'd have done something about it. I think his exact words, I'd have got him indicted.
Yeah.
By the way, to know the distinction between right and wrong, if he really does understand that distinction, that's something that people that are at the latter stages of dementia, they lose that ability. They also lose the ability to tell humor. And there was one question where I think the prosecutor asked him, are you not, are you one of the greatest attorneys ever? And I think Tom said, why, thank you, or something along those lines. Did that come off as him trying to be funny, or did he misunderstand what the prosecutor was asking him?
I think it was really hard for Tom Girardi to not agree to that.
Right.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
But he did use humor. There were times his lawyer would come up and say, are you ready? And Tom Girardi would go, he'd straighten his throat. And then he's like, are you ready? And he's like, I don't know. What question are you going to ask?
Well, it seemed like he knew that the prosecutor was the bad guy, even though he said his lawyer was the bad guy, because he kept saying to the prosecutor, be nice to me, be nice to me. So.
Well, the be nice to me, interestingly, some of the phrases we heard him say on his testimony are things that we also saw in letters and in voicemails that they played to the jury.
Yep.
Be nice to me. That was one of the ones the jury had already heard before. So to have these voicemails and these letters and then like put them together as that human being that's sitting there on the stand.
Yeah.
I think that was kind of like made sense.
Yeah. And it seemed like when his clients would call him, he would be where he would ask for their sympathy. And then if they challenged him, he would get mad at them, and then he wouldn't give them much time to talk on the phone with them. Like he was always in a hurry. Is that kind of how it came out when he would speak with his clients?
I think the strongest evidence the prosecution put on were these letters he wrote to the clients and the voicemails he left for the clients, because I don't think you could get your head around why a really decent lawyer would do that. He would say it with a lot of charm, and he would say things like, oh, I really feel bad for you. I would be mad too. I would be just livid mad if my lawyer wasn't getting me my money after everything you've been through. You're my favorite clients. I tell you what I'm going to do. I am paraphrasing, but this is kind of the gist of what the jury heard. I'm going to write a check out of my own personal account. I'm just going to write you a check. And probably one of the clients, I believe it was Ms. Fernandez, had testified. I apologize if I have my client wrong here, but she had testified that he had promised her that he was going to write this check for her, and it was going to be in an envelope, and it was going to be at the office of Girardi Keese, and she just needed to come pick it up. And she even double checks with the secretary. I mean, you don't want to go anywhere in LA without making sure this is worth the effort.
For sure. Yeah.
And so she checks, and she says, yes, there's an envelope for you here. And she comes to pick it up, and she's supposed to get like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and she has a check for $5,000.
So insulting.
It's and that's what she said. She said it was insulting, and she wrote him emails and said, this is totally, I can't believe that's all you gave me. What lawyer, you rack your brain with like, what is the plausible scenario that a lawyer could legitimately have an excuse here? Some of the excuses were things that I think if you're not a lawyer and you're one of these clients who really just are just trying to survive every day, maybe they believed, he was very convincing. Oh, there's these tax issues he would talk about. There's an annuity. There's a judge that has to sign off on this. People who aren't in that world of mass torts or even law, they wouldn't necessarily question that. And he said it in a way that was very like reassuring. I'm going to talk to him on Tuesday. He had very specific, and then if I don't hear from him from Tuesday, then I'm going to just write you a check, or this should all clear up by Thursday. He had like a lot of promises.
Yeah.
And then he didn't follow through on them.
Stewart and I even said in one of our videos that, if go back 3-4 years, we would have believed Tom Girardi. I mean, he was the king of personal injury. If he had told me something, I probably would have believed it, until I didn't get paid for a while. And then maybe I'd stop believing it. But, that was the type of person that you're dealing with. And the thing that hit me is that there was no evidence that Tom was ever emailing his CFO saying, what's going on here? I keep getting these calls from clients that aren't getting paid. Why are they not being paid? Because that's what I would do if I had a CFO and I was getting calls from clients saying, hey, we haven't received our check. I'd be like, what the heck? What's going on? And it seemed like there was none of that.
Well, there was a lot of testimony about the fact that Tom Girardi didn't use a computer. So when he
Right.
got emails, his secretary would handle the question of whether to print them out and hand them to him. So there was sort of a plausible, deniability, where he just maybe didn't know, because he's not checking emails. So,
Right.
and then the lawyers would kind of discuss whether to show it to him or not. Is this something we need to print out for Tom? There was testimony from junior lawyers who had tried to get these clients paid, and it was like a wall. They would ask other senior partners who would just say, go ask Tom. And then they would ask Tom, and he'd go, I'll take care of it. You need to just back down. You need to move on to other cases. I'm in charge. I'll take care of it. So the way that the firm worked, I mean, but did he have communications with the CFO? Not really. I mean, that is they even described how the defense made a point that they even showed like a blueprint of how the office was actually two buildings stuck together, and the CFO was in one building and Tom was in another. And so they literally didn't even communicate back and forth all that much.
Yeah, it just did not seem believable to me at all that Tom Girardi would not have known what was happening here. So in the end, I mean, Tom Girardi convicted on all 4 counts, and it seems like the prosecutors did a fantastic job. Obviously, they got the verdict that they wanted. What was your impression of just the prosecutors and how they handled everything?
Well, one kind of interesting note is the lead prosecutor, Scott Patey, actually was an actor before he was a lawyer.
Oh.
And which in Los Angeles is probably not all that unusual, but
Right.
Is an interesting career shift. So when he spoke, it was very easy to listen to him. He was a very he knew how to speak to an audience. It was very clear. And then Ali Magadas was also very dramatic. Like he pointed to the defendant and used his hands a lot. And I think everyone felt like there was a lot of very clear and dramatic arguments from the prosecutors. The defense, there were 3 lawyers on the public defender's side, and Charles Snyder was probably the lead who did most of the trial. I think they had a little bit more trouble, but I really do feel like they brought up everything they could have brought up in this trial. They really did. And you have to kind of acknowledge that, because I think they were handed a really difficult case. And I think they brought up things that made you think.
Yeah. No, I think that they did the best with what they had. I mean, what more could they do? So his sentencing set for December 6th. He's not in custody right now. He's living in a care facility, from what I understand, or assisted living facility is what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so not much of a flight risk, I suppose. So they decided to not take him into custody.
Right.
And so next up is, we keep calling him Christopher Kamen. Is it Kamen?
In the trial, they said Camone.
Camone. Okay.
But again, somebody that wouldn't be on most people's radar in the first place. So who is this guy, right? And he came with witnesses who were this really colorful construction company owner who walked into the courtroom and said, "Hi, everybody." And I mean, he was from another world than most of the people we had been listening to, lawyers and accountants and people like that. And then this guy walks in and he's got a hat and plaid shirt on, and he's just, keeps accidentally talking over the lawyer, and oh, whoops, he would say,
Oh, okay.
And then
that's weird.
Exactly the face that I think most of us have.
Yeah, it's like,
what world was this Camone guy part of, right? And then you had an ex-girlfriend who was getting a payment every month in a house, which I think some people might have referred to her as an escort. So she gets on there with her, on Zoom, but she, it was another world out there that Camone was operating. And I think that was just, we'll see about him. He's actually been charged alongside with Mr. Girardi. And his trial, I actually was trying to look this up because his trial is in front of the same judge on January 21st.
Okay.
And it was severed from Mr. Girardi because, they were blaming each other. And the judge, we're not going to do a trial very well that way.
Yeah, and we weren't going to hear testimony from Camone in Girardi's trial because he still can take the fifth and he doesn't have to testify. And so they end up having to kind of find other witnesses to fill in those gaps, which they did with the girlfriend or whatever she was. So yeah, that's going to be a really interesting trial. And so obviously we'll be paying attention to that one. I'm assuming you will too.
Yeah, I think so. I'm planning to. There's also prosecutors in Chicago who have charged Tom Girardi and Mr. Camone and David Lira, who is Tom Girardi's son-in-law, who also worked at Girardi case. And the reason he is charged in Chicago is because he worked on the Lion Air cases. And I believe that trial is actually March of next year.
That's a civil case, isn't it?
No.
Is that criminal? Okay,
Yeah.
I thought there was a civil case also filed in relation to the Lion Air.
Yeah, I think that's Jay Edelson's case.
Yeah, that's right. Correct. Yes.
But that's all on hold because of the bankruptcy. So I think that's been kind of like sidelined a lot, along with a lot of other suits against Tom Girardi. But in the criminal side, yeah, you have prosecutors planning to go to trial in Chicago. I'm looking at my notes here, March 3rd of next year. And that one is actually, in this trial, the prosecutors were trying to put on evidence that there was $15 million taken from 4 clients. In the prosecutors in Chicago have brought a case that involves $3 million, and it's the Lion Air victims. It's a smaller amount, but it does involve Mr. Lira, who, if you sat through in the Lion Air case, the judge in the Lion Air case had held sanctions hearings with Mr. Lira, as well as another partner in Girardi case named Keith Griffin. And they testified for 3 days. And if you listen to that, he's got a lot of interesting stories.
Oh, wow.
It'll be interesting to hear his perspective. And I don't know if he's going to get severed from Girardi and all that mess. But one thing I did want to point out is there were other names of Girardi case partners who came up in this trial repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
David Lira was one, Keith Griffin was one, Chris Almay was one. And Jack Girardi, who is Tom Girardi's brother, also came up several times. And it did make me wonder, the government has been very clear. The prosecutors in Los Angeles have said this is an open investigation. They're not done. And so we may not be done here.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
It's going to be very interesting. And there's so much we probably still don't know. And we probably will find out with Camone's trial as that, gets underway. So it's just unbelievable, everything that's happened here. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. We can't thank you enough for joining us. It's absolutely great to talk to you. We loved your reporting and love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for using my tweets and materials. So I'm glad I was able to tell the story for those who couldn't be there.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
Great to meet with you, Amanda. This has been great.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we will keep you posted on more updates as Girardi and the Chris Camone trial gets underway. And thank you also for joining us on one of our first lives, but we will be back very shortly, and we hope you have a great day.